Hello and welcome back. In today's video, I'm overclocking the AMD Ryzen 9 7950 X3D CPU all the way up to 5.9 GHz using the ASUS ROG Crosshair X670E Extreme motherboard and Eclk Quantum custom loop water cooling. Before we get going, I want to say a quick thank you to the folks at AMD that decided to unlock the X3D for overclocking. That's a different approach than with the first generation of Ryzen X3D CPUs, and I like that. That doesn't mean that the overclocking is fully supported or that it's as easy to overclock the X3D CPUs as it is to overclock the regular Ryzen 7000 CPUs. But the intent is there and I like that. Anyway, we have a lot to go through in this video, so let's get started. The AMD Ryzen 9 7950 X3D CPU is part of the third wave of Ryzen 7000 Zen 4 AM5 desktop processors. The first wave of Zen 4 Ryzen 7000 processors launched on August 29, 2022 during an AMD livestream. At launch, there were 4 X SKUs available, ranging from the 6-core 105W Ryzen 5 7600X to the 16-core 170W Ryzen 9 7950X. The second wave of Ryzen 7000 processors launched on January 4, 2023 during AMD's CES 2023 keynote. This wave consisted of 3 non-X SKUs available a few days after the announcement. The SKUs range from the 6-core 65W Ryzen 5 7600 to the 12-core 65W Ryzen 9 7900. At the CES 2023 keynote, AMD also announced the third wave of Ryzen 7000 processors, which consist of exclusively X3D variants with 3D V-Cache. The lineup consists of 3 SKUs ranging from the 120W 8-core 7800 X3D to the 16-core 7950 X3D. The Ryzen 7 7800 X3D is a direct successor of the Ryzen 7 5800 X3D, AMD's first consumer CPU with 3D V-Cache. Despite being locked for overclocking, we overclocked the Ryzen 7 5800 X3D in SkatterBencher number 39. The 7950 X3D and 7900 X3D are the first dual CCD Ryzen X3D enabled processors. I won't say too much about the technical aspect of 3D V-Cache, as plenty of other media will cover that part of the X3D story. But long story short, AMD has 3D stacked additional L3 cache on top of the CCD to expand the on-die cache capacity. That, in theory, should help improve the performance in latency-sensitive workloads. We'll discuss the V-Cache and its impact on performance later in this video. The Ryzen 9 7950 X3D has 2 8-core CCDs, totaling 16 cores with 32 threads. One of those CCDs has V-Cache while the other doesn't. The base frequency is 4.2 GHz and the maximum listed boost frequency is 5.7 GHz. The TDP is 120 watt and the PPT is 162 watt. In this video, we will cover 3 overclocking strategies. First, we rely on AMD PBO2 and EXPO performance boost technologies. Second, we tune Precision Boost Overdrive 2 with Curve Optimizer. Third, we tune Precision Boost Overdrive 2 with asynchronous Eclk. However, before we get going with the overclocking, let's have a quick look at the hardware and the benchmarks that we'll be using in this guide. The system we're using for this overclocking guide consists of the following hardware. I explain how I use the Elmo Labs products in SkatterBencher number 34. To make a long story short, I connect the EFC to the EVC2 device, and that allows me to monitor the ambient temperature, water temperature, and fan duty cycle. I also include these measurements in my Prime 95 stability test results. I also use the Elmo Labs EFC to map the radiator fan curve to the water temperature. Without going into too many details, I've attached an external temperature sensor from the water in the loop to the EFC. Then I use the low-high setting to map the fan curve from 25 to 40 degrees water temperature. I use this configuration for all overclocking strategies. The main takeaway from this configuration is that it gives us a good indicator of whether the cooling solution is saturated. We use Windows 11 and the following benchmark applications to measure performance and ensure system stability. I added Geekbench 6 right before finalizing the script as it had just launched a few days ago. I will phase out Geekbench 5 and replace it with Geekbench 6 in future SkatterBencher guides. Before starting overclocking, of course we must check the performance at default settings. The default parameters for the Precision Boost 2 algorithm for this 7950 X3D CPU are as follows. These values don't tell the whole picture of how Precision Boost works on the 7000 X3D processors. I'll get back to that later in the video. Here's the benchmark performance at stock. Here are the 3D Mark CPU profile scores at stock. When running Prime 95 small FFTs with AVX 512 enabled, the average CPU effective clock is 4255 MHz with 0.9 volts. The average CPU temperature is 66.8 degrees Celsius. The ambient and water temperature is 23.2 and 30.6 degrees Celsius. The average CPU package power is 121.6 watts. When running Prime 95 small FFTs with AVX disabled, the average CPU effective clock is 4553 MHz with 0.959 volts. The average CPU temperature is 81.5 degrees Celsius. The ambient and water temperature is 23.2 and 30.8 degrees Celsius, and the average CPU package power is 134.2 watts. Now let us try our first overclocking strategy, but before that, make sure to locate the Clear CMOS button. Pressing the Clear CMOS button will reset all your BIOS settings to default, which is helpful if you want to start your BIOS configuration from scratch. In our first overclocking strategy, we will leverage AMD exclusive features like Precision Boost Overdrive 2 and extended profiles for overclocking. However, before we start talking about Precision Boost Overdrive, let's return to the Precision Boost technology topic. I spoke at length about the Precision Boost technology in my Raphael launch video. In order to fully understand what I'm about to explain about overclocking the Ryzen 9 7950 X3D, it's good to have a thorough understanding of how Precision Boost works. Precision Boost 2 is an automatic performance maximizing technology available in all AMD Ryzen processors since the 2018 Ryzen 2000 series. This technology improves system performance by dynamically increasing your processor clock speeds beyond stock depending on many factors, including temperature, power consumption, current draw, and the number of active cores. The fundamental building block of the Precision Boost technology is the SMU, or System Management Unit. Each chip on your Raphael CPU has an SMU, meaning there are 3 SMUs on a Ryzen 9 7950 X3D CPU. One of those SMUs functions as master SMU, while the others work as slave SMUs. Typically, the SMU in the I/O die would be the master SMU. All SMUs are connected using a low bandwidth control bus called SCF, or Scalable Control Fabric. The SMU has a range of capabilities, including, most importantly, the ability to manage the CPU performance within the infrastructure constraints. The infrastructure restricts the maximum operating limits on various metrics, including power draw, temperature, and voltage. The primary function of the SMUs is to capture the measurement data related to the infrastructure limits, then prepare that data to be sent to the master SMU. The master SMU's primary function is to analyze the package-wide measurement data and determine the actions needed for performance management. Each infrastructure limit has its algorithm and is managed independently by the master SMU to determine the infrastructure limited frequency. The firmware then selects the most constraining limit as the global frequency limit. Then either of two things can happen. Either the frequency exceeds the limit or it doesn't. If the frequency exceeds the limit, then the frequency will be reduced. If the frequency doesn't exceed the limit, then the frequency will be increased. Either way, the master SMU passes the frequency change request to the slave SMU, and then each slave SMU applies the frequency changes to the CPU cores of the local die. The frequency changes are coordinated with the global voltage plane by the master SMU. Now comes the part that is important for Ryzen 7000 X3D overclocking. Every slave can make independent decisions based on local conditions. So it can apply lower frequencies than the frequency requested by the master SMU if the on-die conditions require so. For example, one CCX may run at a lower frequency in all core workloads. Additionally, when DLDO is enabled, each SMU can independently adjust the voltage for each core within the CCX. The Precision Boost algorithm has many infrastructure limiters, some of which are even exposed to the end user. While all of these limiters are present on Ryzen 7000 CPUs, it doesn't mean that they're all active or configured. Furthermore, the infrastructure limiters can differ CCD to CCD. For example, the CCD0, the one with the Vcache, is severely more restricted than our CCD1, the one without the Vcache. Here's a list of the Precision Boost limiters we're aware of. I discussed these at length in my Raphael Overclocking What's New launch video, so I'll only discuss the relevant ones for the Ryzen 9 7950 X3D. The main limiter constraining the Ryzen 9 7950 X3D is the voltage limit. I will refer to the Vcache CCD as CCD0 and the non-Vcache CCD as CCD1. As you can see from the table, the VID limit for both Ryzen 7000 X3D CCDs is lower than that of a regular 7950X processor. Furthermore, at 1.2 volt, the voltage limit for CCD0 is significantly lower than for CCD1. Raphael only has one VDDCR voltage rail powering the CPU cores inside the CCDs via the VDDCR CPU voltage rail and the cache via the VDDCR VDDM rail. When any core in CCD0 is active, it will also restrict the maximum voltage for the cores in CCD1. That will also constrain its operating frequency. Note that the VID limits are the absolute limits at zero load. As you increase the load on a CCD, the Precision Boost algorithm will further reduce the maximum allowed voltage. The maximum voltage in an all-core workload with active cores in CCD0 is a mere 1 volt. That's similar to the maximum voltage for a stock non-X Ryzen 7000 processor. The maximum voltage in an all-core workload for CCD1 is 1.2 volt. Another limit constraining the Ryzen 9 7950 X3D is the Fmax limit. Unsurprisingly, the CCD with Vcache cannot run at equivalent speeds to the non-Vcache CCD, since the L3 cache operates at the same frequency. We also saw this with the Ryzen 7 5800 X3D, which had a 200 MHz lower maximum boost clock than the Ryzen 7 5800X. On the Ryzen 9 7950 X3D, CCD0 has an Fmax limit of 5.25 GHz and CCD1 has an Fmax limit of 5.75 GHz. Fortunately, every CCX has its own PLL, so in theory, we'd be able to run all the cores in CCD0 at 5.25 GHz and all the cores in CCD1 at 5.75 GHz at the same time. However, in the real world, that's not going to happen because the CCDs share the same voltage rail and will therefore always run the cores at the same voltage. If only DLDO was available on AM5. There's one last point that I want to discuss regarding the 3D Vcache performance. Obviously, each CCD has its own strength. CCD0 has more cache but a lower frequency, and CCD1 has a higher frequency but less cache. Obviously, you want to run your application on the CCD that provides you with the most advantage, with the highest performance. So how does AMD manage that? Long story short, through drivers. To make a short story slightly longer, you can choose how to prioritize the CCDs in the BIOS. You can let the system drivers take control and prioritize the CCD with extra cache or the CCD with the additional frequency. ASUS ROG has also implemented a custom prioritization algorithm using its Core Flex feature. You can load the X3D Core Flex gaming preset to check its impact on system performance. The Core Flex algorithm is a little complicated, but it comes down to this. There are 3 states, level 1, level 2, and level 3. Levels 1 and 3 prioritize CCD1, and level 2 prioritizes CCD0. 2 threshold values trigger the states, level 1 and level 2 threshold. The profile's condition to check is the core current, and the threshold values are 20 and 50 amps, respectively. If the core current is below 20 amps, level 1 state is active. If the core current is between 20 and 50 amps, level 2 state is active. and if the core current exceeds 50 amps, level 3 state is active. An active state doesn't mean there's core reprioritization just yet. In addition to the core current check, there's also a memory activity threshold. CCD priority switching will only occur if the memory activity exceeds the threshold. You can interpret the algorithm as follows. If the system is idle, there's no CCD reprioritization. In case of a memory-intensive workload that doesn't use more than 8 cores, CoreFlex prioritizes CCD0 with Vcache to benefit from the extra L3 cache. In case of a memory-intensive workload that utilizes more than 8 cores, CoreFlex prioritizes CCD1 to benefit from the higher average CPU frequency. It's not easy to get a good feeling of what approach to CCD prioritization gives you the best performance. So I suggest that you just try it on your own system and see what works best. It would be remiss of me to not at the very least mention the lesser known Precision Boost C-State limiter. I made a video on this specific topic a while back, so I won't go into the details here, but it's a pertinent topic when it comes to Ryzen performance tuning. Long story short, since AGISA 1003, the Precision Boost C-State boost limiter prevents Zen 4 CPUs from boosting over 5.5 GHz when more than 4 cores are active. However, this C-State limiter appears not present on AGISA 1005, which came with this BIOS. I've not been able to confirm this with a regular X SKU, so be on the lookout for forum posts or media reports. That includes our shallow dive in the Precision Boost 2 technology. There's a lot more to the clocking and the voltage of Ryzen 7000 CPUs, but I'll refer you to my Raphael launch video for that. Now it's time to get into the overclocking of the 7950 X3D processor. With the launch of Zen 3, AMD introduced an improved version of Precision Boost Overdrive. They call this Precision Boost Overdrive 2. The Precision Boost Overdrive 2 toolkit still provides us with the tools to manually tune the parameters that are governing the Precision Boost algorithm. Precision Boost Overdrive 2 builds on the PBO implementation of Zen 2. In addition to the platform overclocking knobs from Zen Plus, PPT, TDC, and EDC, and processor overclocking knobs from Zen 2, Boost Override, and Scalar, Precision Boost Overdrive 2 introduces Curve Optimizer. There are essentially 3 levels of AMD Precision Boost Overdrive. AMD's stock values, which can be set by disabling PBO, the motherboard vendor values, which are programmed into the BIOS to match the motherboard VRM specification and can be set by enabling PBO, and custom values, which the end user can program. In this overclocking strategy, we're just enabling Precision Boost Overdrive, whereas in the next strategies, we'll also look into tuning the various parameters. We rely on the motherboard's pre-programmed PBO parameters by enabling Precision Boost Overdrive. We find that the following values have changed. For previous generation Ryzen CPUs, increasing the platform boost parameters substantially impacted the performance, especially for the higher core count CPUs. For Ryzen 7000X series CPUs, however, AMD's default platform parameters were relatively unconstraining. For the X3D series CPUs, however, it seems the limiters are again slightly more constraining. During a Prime 95 non-AVX workload, TDC and EDC are close to or at the limit. EXPO stands for AMD Extended Profiles for Overclocking. It's an AMD technology that enables ubiquitous memory overclocking profiles for AMD platforms supporting DDR5 memory. EXPO allows memory vendors such as G.Skill to program higher performance settings onto the memory sticks. If your motherboard supports EXPO, you can enable higher performance with the click of a single button. So it saves you from a lot of manual configuration. While our memory kit is rated at DDR5 6400, I couldn't quite make it work stably on this system, so I had to settle for DDR5 6000 instead. Upon entering the BIOS, go to the Extreme Tweaker menu. Set AI Overclock Tuner to EXPO 1. Set a memory frequency to DDR5 6000. Enter the Precision Boost Overdrive submenu. Set Precision Boost Overdrive to Enabled, then save and exit the BIOS. We reran the benchmarks and checked the performance increase compared to the default operation. As expected, enabling Precision Boost Overdrive does little to improve the system's performance. After all, the CPU is primarily limited by the operating voltage, not by any platform power parameters. Thanks to enabling EXPO, we do get a performance improvement of plus 8.17% in AI benchmark. When running Prime 95, small FFTs with AVX 512 enabled, the average CPU effective clock is 4261 MHz with 0.9 volts. The average CPU temperature is 67.6 degrees Celsius. The ambient and water temperature is 25 and 32.1 degrees Celsius. The average CPU package power is 132 watts. When running Prime 95, small FFTs with AVX disabled, the average CPU effective clock is 4540 MHz with 0.958 volts. The average CPU temperature is 82.6 degrees Celsius. The ambient and water temperature is 25.1 and 32.6 degrees Celsius, and the average CPU package power is 143.9 watts. In our second overclocking strategy, we will make use of the IFMAX Boost Override and Curve Optimizer tools included in the Precision Boost Overdrive 2 toolkit. IFMAX is one of the precision boost limiters constraining the CPU performance. Essentially, it determines the absolute maximum CPU frequency that any of your CPU cores are allowed to run. Boost Clock Override, or IFMAX Override, is one of the overclocker tools available in the PBO2 toolkit. It allows the user to override the arbitrary clock frequency limit between minus 1000 MHz and plus 200 MHz in steps of 25 MHz. It's available for both the CPU core clock and, if present, the graphics core clock. We need to make two important notes about Boost Clock Override. The override only adjusts the upper ceiling of the frequency and doesn't act as a frequency offset. Ultimately, the Precision Boost 2 algorithm still determines the actual operating frequency. CCD0, the one with Vcache, appears locked from increasing the Fmax. So while setting a negative boost override to lower the Fmax works, setting a positive boost override to increase the Fmax doesn't work. The Fmax remains at 5250 MHz. As I mentioned earlier in this video, Curve Optimizer is an important new feature in the Precision Boost Overdrive 2 Overclockers toolkit. Curve Optimizer allows the end user to fine-tune the CPU's VFT curve. VFT stands for Voltage Frequency Temperature Curve, and it's essentially a table that determines for each core in your CPU what voltage to run for a specific frequency and temperature. The higher your frequency or the higher your operating temperature, the higher the voltage you'll need. Curve Optimizer adjusts the VFT curve by offsetting the voltages of the factory-fused VFT curve. By setting a positive offset, you increase the voltage point. Conversely, you decrease the voltage point by setting a negative offset. The traditional approach for AMD Ryzen CPU overclocking is to use a negative curve optimizer. Two things happen when you do that. First, you tell the CPU that it needs less voltage for a given frequency, and as a consequence, at a given voltage, it can apply a higher frequency. Second, the CPU temperature will be lower because you use less voltage at a given frequency. That extra thermal headroom will also encourage the Precision Boost algorithm to target higher voltages and frequencies. As I mentioned already, Curve Optimizer is available on a per-core basis, and that gives us a tangible, real-world benefit as it allows us to push some of the better cores a lot higher than the other weaker cores. The manual tuning process with Curve Optimizer can become quite convoluted because it spans a wide range of scenarios, going from single-threaded light workloads all the way to all-core heavy workloads. The tuning process that I followed for this CPU was as follows. In my case, I used a per-core curve optimizer ranging from -40 on core 6 to -15 on core 2, and an Fmax boost override of plus 150 MHz. I will show you the BIOS configuration in a minute, but first, please note that the per-core curve optimizer settings are CPU specific, and the optimal values of your CPU may differ substantially. The following table shows the boost profile for this specific CPU. We can make a couple of interesting observations. At stock, the boost curve shows several cores running higher than the advertised boost frequency of 5.7 GHz. That's not unexpected, as we know the fused Fmax is 5.75 GHz, but it's still nice to see some cores over-delivering on their promise. Furthermore, we can also see that several Vcache cores run at their Fmax of 5250 MHz. It's also interesting to see the average frequency across an increasing number of active threads during the Shamina boost curve workload. It nicely shows how the average frequency decreases when the first 8 CCD1 cores are loaded, then 8 CCD0 cores, then the 8 SMT CCD1 cores, and finally the 8 SMT CCD0 cores. After curve optimizing, we see a substantial frequency uplift across the board. Some cores almost hit the new Fmax ceiling of 5.9 GHz, and all Vcache cores hit the 5.25 GHz Fmax. The average frequency under load also increased by roughly 200 MHz across the board. Upon entering the BIOS, go to the Extreme Tweaker menu. Set AI Overclock Tuner to EXPO 1. Set memory frequency to DDR5 6000. Enter the Precision Boost Overdrive submenu. Set Precision Boost Overdrive to Enabled. Set CPU Boost Clock Override to Enabled Positive. Set Max CPU Boost Clock Override to 150. Enter the Curve Optimizer submenu. Set Curve Optimizer to Per Core. For every core, set Curve Optimizer sign to negative. For cores 0, 5, 9, and 12, set Curve Optimizer magnitude to 30. For cores 1, 3, 8, 10, and 11, set Curve Optimizer magnitude to 20. For core 2, set Curve Optimizer magnitude to 15. For cores 4, 14, and 15, set Curve Optimizer magnitude to 35. For core 6, set Curve Optimizer magnitude to 40. For cores 7 and 13, set Curve Optimizer magnitude to 35. Then save and exit the BIOS. We reran the benchmarks and checked the performance increase compared to the default operation. While the performance uplift after curve optimizing is not earth-shattering, it's nice to see we achieve better performance across the board. We see the highest performance improvement of plus 10.54% in AI benchmark. When running Prime 95 small FFTs with AVX512 enabled, the average CPU effective clock is 4432 MHz with 0.885 volts. The average CPU temperature is 67.6 degrees Celsius. The ambient and water temperature is 23.4 and 30.8 degrees Celsius. The average CPU package power is 137.7 watts. When running Prime 95 small FFTs with AVX disabled, the average CPU effective clock is 4732 MHz with 0.945 volts. The average CPU temperature is 82.5 degrees Celsius. The ambient and water temperature is 23.7 and 31.9 degrees Celsius. The average CPU package power is 150 watts. In our final overclocking strategy, we will leverage Eclk mode. Eclk stands for external clock and does exactly what the term suggests. It allows us to use an external clock generator. This function was previously available on Ryzen 2000 Pinnacle Ridge CPUs, but then was later removed until the Ryzen 7000 CPUs. It's back. The standard Raphael platform has a 48 MHz crystal input to the integrated CGPLL clock generator. The CGPLL then generates a 48 MHz clock for the USB PLL and a 100 MHz reference clock for the FCH, which contains the CCLK PLL for the CPU cores and several SoC PLLs. In addition to the standard internal CGPLL, Raphael supports up to 2 external clock modes. They're called Eclk 0 mode and Eclk 1 mode. In Eclk 0 mode, an external 100 MHz reference clock is used for both the CPU and SoC PLLs. In other words, it's a reference clock that affects the CPU core clocks as well as the PCIe and SATA clocks. In Eclk 1 mode, there are 2 distinct external 100 MHz reference clocks. One clock provides the 100 MHz input for the CPU PLL, and another provides the 100 MHz reference clock for the SoC PLLs. In previous SkatterBencher guides, the one before Ryzen 7000, I referred to using the reference clock as supercharging PBO. Unlike previous platforms, using the reference clock for overclocking a Ryzen 7000 CPU is actually very well supported, and it provides us with a real viable path for performance tuning. The overclocking strategy with Eclk is the polar opposite of what we're used to with Ryzen CPUs. OC strategy number 2 shows that Ryzen overclocking is typically done with a negative curve optimizer. That pushes the precision boost algorithm to reach higher boost frequencies. With Eclk, we still build on the factory-fused VFD curve, but adjust the frequency by adjusting the reference clock. For example, if there's a VFD point for 5 GHz at 1.15 volt at 50 degrees Celsius, with an Eclk of 105 MHz, the actual point will be 5250 MHz at 1.15 volt at 50 degrees Celsius. The default voltage for this VFD point won't suffice for stable operation. So, counterintuitively, we use a positive curve optimizer to increase the voltages of the VFD point. One more critical point. Eclk also affects the maximum frequency ceiling. With an Eclk of 105 MHz, the newly programmed Fmax for the 7950 X3D is 5750 MHz multiplied by 1.05 equaling 6038 MHz. That's way too high for this CPU. With non-X3D CPUs, we could use a negative Fmax boost override to fix this. However, it's a little more complicated since the CCDs in the 7950 X3D have a different default Fmax. So reducing the Fmax for CCD1 also impacts CCD0. The manual tuning process with Eclk can become quite convoluted because it spans a wide range of scenarios going from light single-threaded workloads to heavy all-core workloads. The tuning process that I followed for this CPU was as follows. In my case, I used an Eclk of 104 MHz and a per-core curve optimizer ranging from 0 on core 7 to plus 25 on core 2. I will show you the BIOS configuration in a minute, but first, please note that these settings, especially the curve optimizer ones, are CPU specific, and the optimal values for your CPU may differ substantially. The following table shows the boost profile for this specific CPU. We can make a couple of interesting observations. We can use Eclk tuning to increase the frequency of the cores in the locked 3D Vcache CCD. It also helps us to improve the frequency in the other CCD, though not much more than what we got from curve optimizing. While tuning with Eclk provides, generally speaking, higher boost frequencies than tuning exclusively with curve optimizer, the maximum boost frequencies are not that far apart. Overall, the Eclk strategy typically provides an avenue to slightly higher frequencies at the cost of slightly higher voltages. While this offers better performance in light workloads, the higher voltages will push the CPU quicker to the thermal limit. Thus, in heavy workloads, strictly using the curve optimizer tool for undervolting yields slightly better results. Upon entering the BIOS, go to the Extreme Tweaker menu. Set AI Overclock Tuner to EXPO 1. Set Eclk mode to asynchronous mode. Set BCLK2 frequency to 104. Set memory frequency to DDR5 6000. Enter the Precision Boost Overdrive submenu. Set Precision Boost Overdrive to enabled. Enter the Curve Optimizer submenu. Set Curve Optimizer to per core. For every core, set Curve Optimizer sign to positive. For cores 0, 4, 5, 8, and 10, set Curve Optimizer magnitude to 10. For core 1, set Curve Optimizer magnitude to 20. For core 2, set Curve Optimizer magnitude to 25. For core 3, set Curve Optimizer magnitude to 15. For cores 6, 9, 11, 12, and 13, set Curve Optimizer magnitude to 5. For cores 7, 14, and 15, set Curve Optimizer magnitude to 0, then save and exit the BIOS. We rerun the benchmarks and check the performance increase compared to the default operation. While we can increase the performance over stock, it's clear that the need for using a positive curve optimizer is impacting the overall performance. As expected, we see the most significant improvement in single-threaded benchmarks, especially those running on the Vcache CCD. However, in multi-threaded benchmarks, we see less improvement than with curve optimizing due to the need for using the positive curve optimizer. We get the highest performance improvement of plus 9.63% in Geekbench 6 Multi. When running Prime 95 small FFTs with AVX 512 enabled, the average CPU effective clock is 4307 MHz with 0.905 volts. The average CPU temperature is 68.2 degrees Celsius. The ambient and water temperature is 22.5 and 31.1 degrees Celsius. The average CPU package power is 140.8 watts. When running Prime 95 small FFTs with AVX disabled, the average CPU effective clock is 4592 MHz with 0.963 volts. The average CPU temperature is 83.3 degrees Celsius. The ambient and water temperature is 22.3 and 31.3 degrees Celsius. The average CPU package power is 152.1 watts. Alright, let's wrap this up. I want to kick things off by repeating what I said at the very beginning of the video. And that's by thanking the folks at AMD that decided to enable overclocking for this generation of X3D processors. Overclocking today is very different than what it was 15 years ago, as nowadays it actually requires a substantial effort to enable, support, and validate the overclocking toolkit. I just want to say that I really appreciate that AMD went through this effort. That's not to say that overclocking the 7000 X3D CPUs is going to be very easy or is even fully supported. Manual overclocking is still not available, and the CCD with the Vcache is severely restricted in terms of maximum voltage as well as maximum frequency. But you get the curve optimizer, so you can tweak with a negative curve offset and get maybe a little bit more frequency. And if you really want to, you can also use a synchronous Eclk to push up the frequency in your Vcache CCD. So those options are available. Anyway, that's it for me today. I want to thank you for watching, and I want to thank the patrons for the support. As per usual, I will have a written version of this video up on my blog if you want to read through the BIOS settings or check my performance results. As per usual, if you have any questions, drop them in the comment section below, and see you next time.